Question 1. The performance metrics show a pilot experiencing a new medical condition that may affect their ability to obtain or retain a medical certificate. The pilot confides in their ground instructor, seeking advice on how to approach their upcoming appointment with an aviation medical examiner, AIM. Which of the following represents the most appropriate and regulatory compliant course of action for the ground instructor? Option A. Advise the pilot to be completely truthful and provide all requested documentation to the AME, emphasizing that the AME is the sole authority for medical certification. Option B. Recommend that the pilot seek a second opinion from another pilot who has successfully navigated a similar medical issue before consulting the AME. Option C. Offer the pilot a personal assessment of their condition based on the instructor's general aviation knowledge, and advise them on whether they are likely to pass the medical exam. Option D. Suggest to the pilot that they focus on highlighting their flying experience and positive safety record to the AME, potentially downplaying the severity of the new medical condition. Correct answer is A. Advise the pilot to be completely truthful and provide all requested documentation to the AME, emphasizing that the AME is the sole authority for medical certification. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a ground instructor to navigate the complex and sensitive relationship between a pilot's medical certification and their ability to continue flying, while also adhering strictly to regulatory requirements concerning aviation medical examiners, AIM. The instructor must balance the pilot's desire to continue flying with the paramount importance of aviation safety and regulatory compliance. Misinterpreting or misapplying AME guidelines can have severe consequences, including endangering the pilot and others, and violating FAA regulations. The correct approach involves understanding that the AME is the sole authority for determining medical eligibility for a pilot certificate. Ground instructor's role is to provide training and guidance on regulations and procedures, not to make medical judgments or offer opinions on a pilot's medical condition that could influence their decision to fly or their interaction with the AME. The instructor should advise the pilot to be completely truthful and forthcoming with the AME, providing all requested documentation and information without omission or embellishment. This aligns with FAA regulations, specifically 14 CFR Part 61 and Part 67, which mandate that pilots must meet specific medical standards and report any disqualifying medical conditions to the FAA, typically through an AME. The instructor's duty is to facilitate the pilot's understanding of these requirements and encourage compliance, not to circumvent or influence the medical certification process. An incorrect approach would be for the ground instructor to offer advice on how to manage the conversation with the AME or suggest downplaying symptoms. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it undermines the integrity of the medical certification process. The FAA relies on accurate and complete information from pilots to assess their fitness to fly. By advising the pilot to withhold or alter information, the instructor is essentially encouraging a violation of FAA regulations and potentially putting an unqualified individual in the cockpit. This also breaches the ethical responsibility of an instructor to uphold aviation safety standards. Another incorrect approach would be for the ground instructor to attempt to interpret the pilot's medical records or provide a personal opinion on whether the pilot is fit to fly, based on the instructor's non-medical assessment. This is a critical failure because the instructor lacks the medical expertise and legal authority to make such determinations. Only an AME, with access to the pilot's full medical history and the ability to conduct necessary examinations, can make this judgment. The instructor's role is strictly instructional, not diagnostic or prognostic regarding medical fitness. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should always begin with identifying the boundaries of one's professional role and expertise. A ground instructor's expertise lies in aviation knowledge and training, not in medical assessment. When a situation involves medical certification, the instructor's primary responsibility is to guide the pilot towards the appropriate authority, the AIM, and to ensure the pilot understands the regulatory requirements for honesty and full disclosure. The instructor should act as a facilitator of regulatory compliance, not as an intermediary or advisor on medical matters. Question 2. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need for enhanced understanding of localized wind effects on flight operations in coastal regions. As a ground instructor, How would you comparatively explain the distinct influences of sea breezes and land breezes on aircraft operations, focusing on their formation, characteristics, and practical implications for pilots? Option A. Provide a general overview of how wind affects aircraft, without specifically differentiating between sea breezes and land breezes, focusing on general principles of lift and drag. Option B. Describe the meteorological conditions that lead to the formation of sea breezes, but omit a detailed discussion of land breezes and their operational impacts. Option C. Detail the formation and characteristics of sea breezes and land breezes, explaining how their differing wind directions, speeds, and associated turbulence impact aircraft performance during takeoff, landing, and en route flight, and emphasizing the pilot's decision-making process for each. Option D. Explain the theoretical atmospheric pressure gradients that cause wind, without directly relating these concepts to the specific phenomena of sea breezes and land breezes, or their aviation consequences. The correct answer is C. Detail the formation and characteristics of sea breezes and land breezes, explaining how their differing wind directions, speeds, and associated turbulence impact aircraft performance during takeoff, landing, and en route flight, and emphasizing the pilot's decision-making process for each. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a ground instructor to synthesize complex meteorological phenomena with the practical realities of flight operations and student comprehension, all while adhering to specific regulatory guidance. The instructor must not only understand the physics of local wind effects, but also effectively communicate this knowledge to student pilots in a way that directly impacts their safety and decision-making. The core challenge lies in translating theoretical knowledge into actionable, safe aviation practice, ensuring students can anticipate and react appropriately to these localized weather patterns. The correct approach involves a comparative analysis of how sea breezes and land breezes, as distinct local wind effects, influence flight operations in coastal areas. This approach is right because it directly addresses the prompt's requirement for comparative analysis of local wind effects. Specifically, it necessitates explaining the formation, direction, and strength of each phenomenon, and then detailing their respective impacts on aircraft performance, navigation, and pilot decision-making during takeoff, landing, and en route phases. This aligns with the ground instructor's responsibility to impart comprehensive knowledge of weather phenomena relevant to aviation safety, as mandated by regulatory frameworks that emphasize understanding and applying meteorological principles to flight operations. The instructor must ensure students grasp the differences in wind speed, direction, and turbulence associated with each breeze, enabling them to make informed go/no-go decisions and adjust flight parameters accordingly. An incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the general concept of wind, without differentiating between sea and land breezes. This fails to meet the comparative analysis requirement and provides insufficient detail for students to understand the unique challenges each presents. It is ethically and regulatorily deficient because it omits critical information that directly impacts flight safety in coastal environments. Another incorrect approach would be to discuss only one of the phenomena, either sea breeze or land breeze, in isolation. This neglects the comparative aspect of the question and provides an incomplete picture of local wind effects. Such an approach would fail to equip students with the full spectrum of knowledge needed to navigate coastal airspace safely, potentially leading to misjudgment and hazardous situations. A further incorrect approach would be to present a purely theoretical explanation of atmospheric pressure gradients without linking it directly to observable wind patterns and their aviation implications. While scientifically accurate, this approach lacks the practical application and safety focus expected of a ground instructor. It fails to translate meteorological theory into the concrete, safety-critical information that student pilots require. The professional decision-making process for similar situations involves a systematic approach. First, thoroughly understanding the regulatory requirements and the specific learning objectives for the topic. Second, identifying the core concepts to be taught and how they relate to aviation safety. Third, structuring the instruction in a clear, comparative, and practical manner, using real-world examples where possible. Finally, assessing student comprehension to ensure they can apply the knowledge effectively in operational contexts. This ensures that instruction is not only accurate but also relevant, actionable, and compliant with aviation training standards. Question 3. What factors determine the fundamental principles of Earth's shape and coordinate systems as they apply to aerial navigation for a ground instructor? Option A. The Earth's perfect spherical shape, which simplifies the calculation of distances and bearings for all flight paths. Option B. The arbitrary placement of grid lines on a flat map projection, independent of the Earth's actual curvature. Option C. The sole purpose of latitude and longitude being for cartographic representation, without direct relevance to flight path calculations. Option D. The Earth's approximation as an oblate spheroid, leading to the geometric definition of latitude and longitude as a system for determining position and great circle routes. The correct answer is D. The Earth's approximation as an oblate spheroid, leading to the geometric definition of latitude and longitude as a system for determining position and great circle routes. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because a ground instructor must accurately convey fundamental aeronautical knowledge to students, ensuring their comprehension and safe application of this knowledge. Misunderstanding or misrepresenting concepts like Earth's shape and coordinate systems can lead to critical errors in navigation, flight planning, and situational awareness, directly impacting flight safety. The instructor's responsibility extends beyond mere information delivery. It involves fostering a deep understanding that can be applied in real-world aviation contexts. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves explaining that the Earth's shape, approximated as a sphere or oblate spheroid for navigational purposes, directly influences the geometry of great circles and room lines. This understanding is foundational to comprehending how latitude and longitude lines are established and used to define positions on the Earth's surface. Latitude lines, parallels, are circles parallel to the equator, indicating north-south position, while longitude lines, meridians, converge at the poles, indicating east-west position. The intersection of these lines forms a coordinate system essential for all forms of navigation, including aerial navigation. This aligns with the FAA's emphasis on foundational aeronautical knowledge as outlined in FAR Part 61 and the Aeronautical Information Manual AIM, which require instructors to teach concepts that enable safe flight operations. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that focuses solely on the Earth being a perfect sphere, without acknowledging its oblate spheroid nature, is an oversimplification that, while often used for basic calculations, can lead to a conceptual gap regarding precise navigational calculations and the slight variations in distance and bearing over long flights. This failure to present a more accurate, albeit still simplified, model can hinder a student's deeper understanding of navigational complexities. An approach that treats latitude and longitude as arbitrary grid lines without explaining their relationship to the Earth's physical characteristics and the concept of great circles would be a significant regulatory failure. FAR 61, 105, B. 1. Requires instruction in aerodynamics, which inherently includes understanding the principles of flight and navigation over a curved Earth. Ignoring the geometric basis of the coordinate system directly undermines this requirement. An approach that suggests latitude and longitude are solely for mapping purposes and have no direct impact on flight path calculations or navigation would be fundamentally incorrect and a severe ethical and regulatory breach. Navigation is the primary application of these coordinate systems in aviation, and failing to connect them to flight operations would render the instruction incomplete and potentially dangerous. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach this topic by first establishing the Earth's approximate shape as a basis for understanding the coordinate system. They should then clearly define latitude and longitude, explaining their orientation and how they are measured. Crucially, the connection between these lines and the concept of great circles, the shortest distance between 2 points on a sphere and room lines, lines of constant bearing, must be explicitly taught, as these are the fundamental principles of aerial navigation. The instructor must ensure students grasp how these concepts translate into practical flight planning and execution, referencing relevant FAA guidance such as the Airplane Flying Handbook, AF, and the AIM for accurate and comprehensive information. Question 4. Examination of the data shows that a student pilot is preparing for their commercial pilot certificate practical test and asks about the regulations governing how airlines and other commercial operators conduct their business. Which approach by the ground instructor best ensures the student is adequately prepared for the operational realities of commercial aviation? Option A. The instructor provides a detailed explanation of 14 CFR Parts 121 and 135, focusing on operational specifications, maintenance responsibilities, and the role of safety management systems within these frameworks. Option B. The instructor reviews the operational aspects of flying, such as aircraft performance and navigation techniques, as these are the most critical skills for commercial operations. Option C. The instructor explains the general principles of aviation safety and risk management that apply to all pilots. Option D. The instructor focuses on the pilot's personal privileges and limitations as a commercial pilot, without delving into operator-specific regulations. The correct answer is A. The instructor provides a detailed explanation of 14 CFR Parts 121 and 135, focusing on operational specifications, maintenance responsibilities, and the role of safety management systems within these frameworks. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because a ground instructor, while not directly involved in flight operations, plays a crucial role in ensuring that students understand and adhere to the regulatory framework governing air carriers and commercial operators. Misinterpreting or failing to adequately convey these regulations can have significant safety and compliance implications for future pilots and the operators they may work for. The instructor must possess a thorough understanding of the applicable regulations to effectively train students. The correct approach involves the ground instructor prioritizing the accurate and comprehensive explanation of the specific regulatory requirements for air carriers and commercial operators as defined by the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, in the United States. This includes detailing operational specifications, maintenance programs, crew resource management, and safety management systems as mandated by regulations such as 14 CFR Part 121 for larger air carriers and 14 CFR Part 135 for commuter and on-demand operations. The instructor must ensure students grasp the intent and practical application of these rules, fostering a culture of compliance and safety from the outset of their training. This aligns directly with the FAA's mandate for ground instruction to prepare pilots for safe and legal operations. An incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the pilot's personal operating privileges and responsibilities, without contextualizing them within the broader regulatory environment of air carriers and commercial operators. This fails to equip students with the understanding of the operational frameworks they will likely encounter and be subject to in their professional careers, neglecting a significant portion of the required knowledge for safe and compliant aviation. Another incorrect approach would be to provide a generalized overview of aviation safety principles without referencing the specific regulatory mandates for air carriers and commercial operators. While safety principles are vital, they are insufficient without the concrete regulatory requirements that govern these types of operations. This approach leaves students with a theoretical understanding, but lacks the practical, legally binding information necessary for compliance. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to emphasize only the operational aspects of flying, such as aircraft performance and navigation, while neglecting the regulatory compliance aspects pertinent to air carriers and commercial operators. This creates a knowledge gap regarding the legal and administrative requirements that underpin safe and lawful commercial aviation activities. The professional decision-making process for ground instructors in this context should involve 1. Identifying the specific learning objectives related to air carrier and commercial operator regulations as outlined in the FAA's Airman Certification Standards (ACS) or Practical Test Standards (PTS). 2. Consulting the most current FAA regulations, e.g., 14 CFR Parts 121, 135, 91 Subpart K, and advisory circulars. 3. Developing lesson plans that clearly explain these regulations and their practical implications. And 4. Employing teaching methods that ensure student comprehension and retention of this critical information. Question 5. When evaluating the atmospheric composition and structure for a ground instructor's curriculum, which approach best ensures a pilot's foundational understanding of the atmospheric environment relevant to flight operations? Option A. Detailing the primary gaseous components and their percentages, followed by a description of the distinct atmospheric layers and their defining characteristics. Option B. Emphasizing the inert nature of nitrogen and its prevalence without discussing other gases or atmospheric layering. Option C. presenting the atmosphere as a homogeneous mixture of gases without differentiating its structural layers or their unique properties. Option D, focusing on the chemical reactions occurring within the atmosphere without relating them to altitude or gas composition. The correct answer is A, detailing the primary gaseous components and their percentages, followed by a description of the distinct atmospheric layers and their defining characteristics. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because a ground instructor must accurately convey complex atmospheric science principles to students who may have varying levels of prior knowledge. Misunderstanding atmospheric composition and structure can lead to critical errors in flight planning, weather interpretation, and aircraft performance assessment, directly impacting safety. The instructor's responsibility is to ensure comprehension of fundamental concepts that underpin safe aviation practices. The correct approach involves explaining the composition of the atmosphere by focusing on the primary gases, nitrogen, oxygen, argon, and their relative percentages, and then detailing the structure by describing the distinct layers, troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, thermosphere, exosphere, and their key characteristics, such as temperature changes with altitude and the presence of the ozone layer in the stratosphere. This approach is correct because it aligns with the foundational knowledge required for pilots and aviation professionals to understand weather phenomena, air density variations, and the operational limits of aircraft. Specifically, understanding the troposphere's role in weather and the stratosphere's relative stability is crucial for flight operations. This aligns with the general principles of aviation education that emphasize understanding the environment in which aircraft operate. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the chemical inertness of nitrogen, without explaining its abundance and impact on air density, is professionally unacceptable. While nitrogen is inert, its significant presence is fundamental to understanding atmospheric pressure and the air's ability to support lift. Failing to mention oxygen's role in combustion and respiration, or its percentage, is also a critical omission, as it directly relates to engine operation and pilot physiology. Another incorrect approach that describes the atmosphere as a uniform layer without differentiating its structural components is also professionally flawed. This ignores the significant variations in temperature, pressure, and phenomena like jet streams and the ozone layer that occur at different altitudes. Such a generalized description would prevent students from understanding why weather is predominantly confined to the troposphere, or why certain aircraft operate at higher altitudes. A professional decision-making process for similar situations involves prioritizing accuracy and completeness in conveying essential scientific principles. The instructor should first identify the core concepts students need to grasp for aviation safety, and then structure the explanation logically, starting with composition and moving to structure. The instructor should also anticipate potential areas of confusion and be prepared to clarify them, ensuring that the information provided is not only factually correct, but also comprehensible and relevant to aviation applications. This systematic approach ensures that the knowledge imparted is robust and directly applicable to the student's future roles in aviation. Question 6. The evaluation methodology shows that a ground instructor is reviewing sectional charts with a student pilot. The instructor encounters the following symbol on the chart, a blue circle with a dot in the center. The student asks what this symbol represents. Which of the following represents the most accurate and professionally responsible response for the ground instructor? Option A. State that the symbol is a general marker for a point of interest, and its exact meaning depends on the context of the surrounding information. Option B. Inform the student that this symbol is a standard airport symbol and that the instructor will look up its precise meaning later if needed. Option C. Explain that the symbol indicates a Vortex station, which is a navigational aid providing VOR and TACAN information. Option D. Describe the symbol as a representation of a military operating area, which requires specific pilot awareness and procedures. The correct answer is C. Explain that the symbol indicates a Vortex station, which is a navigational aid providing VOR and TACAN information. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that a ground instructor must possess a comprehensive understanding of aviation abbreviations and symbols to effectively convey critical information to students. This scenario is professionally challenging because misinterpreting or miscommunicating these symbols can lead to significant safety risks, misunderstandings of operational procedures, and ultimately, a failure to meet regulatory training standards. The instructor's ability to accurately interpret and explain these elements directly impacts student comprehension and adherence to aviation regulations. The correct approach involves accurately identifying and explaining the meaning of aviation abbreviations and symbols as presented on official charts or in regulatory documents. This ensures that students receive correct and up-to-date information, fostering a safe and compliant learning environment. Specifically, referencing the FAA's Aeronautical Information Manual, AIM, or relevant advisory circulars for the definitive meaning of symbols and abbreviations is paramount. This aligns with the regulatory requirement for ground instructors to provide accurate and comprehensive instruction, ensuring students are prepared for real-world aviation operations. An incorrect approach of relying on personal interpretation or outdated knowledge is professionally unacceptable. This failure directly contravenes the regulatory obligation to provide accurate instruction. For instance, assuming the meaning of a symbol without consulting authoritative sources like the AIM can lead to the dissemination of incorrect information, which is a direct violation of the instructor's duty of care and regulatory compliance. Another incorrect approach is to oversimplify or omit the explanation of certain symbols, deeming them less important. This is a critical failure as all symbols and abbreviations on aviation charts and documents serve a specific purpose and are essential for safe navigation and operational understanding. The regulatory framework mandates thoroughness in instruction, and any omission or simplification that compromises student understanding is a serious ethical and regulatory breach. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes accuracy and regulatory adherence. This involves a commitment to continuous learning, regular consultation of authoritative sources, such as the FAA's AIM, ACs, and official chart supplements, and a thorough review of training materials to ensure all abbreviations and symbols are correctly understood and explained. When in doubt, the professional approach is to verify the meaning through official channels rather than making assumptions. Question 7. The risk matrix shows a moderate probability of a student pilot developing a medical condition that could impact their ability to obtain or maintain an FAA medical certificate. You are a ground instructor, and a student confides in you that they have recently been diagnosed with a chronic condition that they believe might affect their vision, which is a critical component for pilot medical certification. The student expresses concern about continuing their training and asks for your opinion on whether they should proceed. Option A. Offer your personal opinion based on your experience as a pilot and ground instructor, advising them on whether you think their vision condition is likely to prevent them from getting a medical certificate. Option B. Reassure the student that many conditions can be managed and encourage them to continue training while they research potential medical waivers. Option C. Suggest the student focus on the theoretical aspects of flight training for now and postpone any practical flight training until they have more clarity on their medical situation. Option D. Advise the student to immediately consult with an aviation medical examiner, AIM, to determine their eligibility for a medical certificate and to discuss the implications of their diagnosis on their pilot training. The correct answer is D. Advise the student to immediately consult with an aviation medical examiner, AIM, to determine their eligibility for a medical certificate and to discuss the implications of their diagnosis on their pilot training. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the ground instructor to balance their duty to uphold aviation safety regulations with their personal relationship with a student. The instructor must make a judgment call that could impact the student's ability to fly and potentially their career, while also adhering strictly to regulatory requirements. The ethical dilemma arises from the potential conflict between loyalty to a student and the overarching responsibility to ensure only medically qualified individuals operate aircraft. The correct approach involves the ground instructor recognizing their limitations and the absolute necessity of adhering to the Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) regulations regarding medical certificates. This approach prioritizes safety and regulatory compliance above personal feelings or assumptions. The FAA mandates that pilots must possess a valid medical certificate appropriate for the class of operation. Ground instructors' role is to educate and prepare students for flight, which includes understanding these fundamental requirements. When a student presents with a condition that might affect their medical certification, the instructor's ethical and professional obligation is to advise the student to consult with an aviation medical examiner (AIM) and to obtain the necessary medical documentation. This aligns with 14 CFR Part 61, which outlines pilot certification requirements, including medical standards. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the student's concerns or to make a personal judgment about their medical fitness. This is professionally unacceptable because it bypasses the established regulatory process for medical certification. The FAA has specific procedures and designated AMEs to assess a pilot's medical qualifications. A ground instructor is not qualified to make such a determination, and doing so would violate 14 CFR Part 61, 103, which states that to exercise the privileges of a pilot certificate, a person must have a current medical certificate. Another incorrect approach would be to allow the student to continue training without addressing the potential medical issue, hoping it resolves itself or is not a significant problem. This is a failure of professional responsibility, as it could lead to the student accumulating training time and expenses under the false pretense of being medically eligible to fly, potentially endangering themselves and others if they are ultimately denied a medical certificate. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a clear understanding of one's role and responsibilities within the regulatory framework. Ground instructors must prioritize regulatory compliance and safety. When faced with a situation that touches upon medical certification, the immediate and correct action is to refer the individual to the appropriate authority, in this case, an AIM. This ensures that the student receives a proper medical evaluation by a qualified professional and that all regulatory requirements are met. It also protects the instructor from potential liability and upholds the integrity of the aviation system. Question 8. Regulatory review indicates that a ground instructor is preparing a lesson on basic aviation terminology for student pilots. The instructor needs to accurately explain the relationship between the terms aircraft and rotorcraft as defined by the Federal Aviation Regulations. Which of the following statements best reflects the regulatory definitions and their relationship? Option A. Aircraft is exclusively defined as a fixed-wing airplane, and a rotorcraft is a separate and distinct category of flying machine. Option B. A rotorcraft is not considered an aircraft because its method of lift is fundamentally different from that of traditional airplanes. Option C. A rotorcraft is a specific type of aircraft, as the broader definition of aircraft encompasses all devices capable of flight, including those lifted by rotors. Option D. The terms aircraft and rotorcraft are interchangeable and refer to the same set of flying machines under all regulatory contexts. The correct answer is C. A rotorcraft is a specific type of aircraft, as the broader definition of aircraft encompasses all devices capable of flight, including those lifted by rotors. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a ground instructor to accurately differentiate between two closely related but distinct aviation terms, aircraft and rotorcraft, as defined by U.S. Federal Aviation Regulations, FAR. Misinterpreting these definitions can lead to incorrect instruction, potentially impacting a student's understanding of regulatory requirements and operational limitations. The challenge lies in applying the precise legal definitions provided by the FAA, rather than relying on common parlance or broader industry understanding. The correct approach involves recognizing that the FARs provide specific, legally binding definitions. The FAA defines aircraft broadly as a device that is used or intended to be used for flight in the air. It then defines rotorcraft as a heavier-than-air aircraft that is lifted and sustained in the air by means of rotors. Therefore, a rotorcraft is a specific type of aircraft. Answering that a rotorcraft is a type of aircraft aligns with these definitions, as the broader category encompasses the specific subcategory. This approach demonstrates a thorough understanding of the regulatory framework and the hierarchical nature of these definitions, ensuring accurate and compliant instruction. An incorrect approach would be to define aircraft as only fixed-wing airplanes. This fails to acknowledge the FAR's broad definition that includes all heavier-than-air and lighter-than-air devices capable of flight. Another incorrect approach would be to state that a rotorcraft is not an aircraft, directly contradicting the regulatory hierarchy, where a rotorcraft is explicitly a subtype of aircraft. Finally, defining rotorcraft solely by its operational characteristics without referencing its classification as a type of aircraft would be incomplete and potentially misleading in a regulatory context. Professionals should approach such situations by prioritizing the specific definitions provided within the governing regulatory framework, in this case, the U.S. FAR. When faced with terms that have both common usage and regulatory definitions, the regulatory definition always takes precedence for compliance and instructional accuracy. A decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying the specific regulatory source for definitions, e.g., FAR Part 1. 2. Carefully reading and understanding the precise wording of each definition. 3. Analyzing the relationship between the terms based on the regulatory text, looking for hierarchical classifications or exclusions. 4. Applying these definitions consistently in instruction and communication. Question 9. Process analysis reveals that a student pilot expresses interest in obtaining a private pilot certificate, but also mentions a long-term aspiration of becoming an airline transport pilot. The ground instructor needs to advise the student on the initial eligibility requirements. Which of the following best represents the ground instructor's approach to ensuring the student understands the foundational prerequisites for their chosen path? Option A. Inform the student that the primary focus should be on the immediate goal of the private pilot certificate, and detailed eligibility for higher certificates can be addressed much later in their training journey. Option B. Emphasize that the student should prioritize obtaining the highest level of medical certificate immediately, as this is the most critical and often the most challenging requirement for all pilot certificates. Option C. Provide a comprehensive overview of the eligibility requirements for a private pilot certificate, including age, language proficiency, and medical certificate, while also briefly outlining the progressively higher requirements for commercial and airline transport pilot certificates to set future expectations. Option D. Advise the student that the requirements for a private pilot certificate are generally sufficient for all higher certificates, and they can focus on learning to fly first. The correct answer is D. Advise the student that the requirements for a private pilot certificate are generally sufficient for all higher certificates, and they can focus on learning to fly first. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because a ground instructor must accurately guide aspiring pilots through the complex and varied eligibility requirements for different pilot certificates. Misinterpreting or misapplying these requirements can lead to significant delays, financial burdens, or even disqualification for the student, undermining the instructor's credibility and the student's progress. Careful judgment is required to ensure all regulatory prerequisites are met before a student begins training or applies for a certificate. The correct approach involves meticulously reviewing the specific eligibility criteria for each pilot certificate category: student, sport, recreational, private, commercial, airline transport, as outlined in the relevant aviation regulations. This includes understanding age, language proficiency, medical certificate requirements, and any prerequisite pilot certificates or ratings. For instance, a student pilot certificate has different age and medical requirements than a commercial pilot certificate. A ground instructor must be able to articulate these distinctions clearly and ensure the student meets them before commencing flight training that counts towards a specific certificate. This adherence to regulatory detail is paramount for ethical instruction and compliance. An incorrect approach would be to provide generalized advice without referencing the specific regulations for each certificate type. This fails to acknowledge the distinct requirements for each level of pilot certification, such as the higher medical standards for commercial and airline transport pilots compared to private pilots, or the specific aeronautical knowledge and experience prerequisites. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that meeting the requirements for one certificate automatically implies meeting them for another, without verifying the specific regulatory language. This oversight can lead to students pursuing training for which they are not yet eligible, resulting in wasted time and resources. A further incorrect approach is to rely on anecdotal information or outdated knowledge rather than consulting the current official regulatory framework. Aviation regulations are subject to change, and relying on informal sources can lead to providing inaccurate information, which is a serious ethical and professional failing. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory accuracy and student success. This involves 1. Identifying the student's specific certificate goal. 2. Consulting the most current official regulatory documents, e.g., FAA Part 61 in the U.S., for the precise eligibility requirements for that certificate. 3. clearly communicating these requirements to the student, explaining the rationale behind them. 4. Verifying the student's fulfillment of each requirement before advising them to proceed with training. 5. Staying updated on any regulatory amendments. Question 10. System analysis indicates that a student pilot is asking about the proper procedure for reporting a lost aircraft in controlled airspace, referencing a specific AIM chapter. As a ground instructor, what is the most professionally responsible and regulatory compliant method to ensure the accuracy of your response? Option A. Rely on your memory of the procedure, as you have taught it many times before. Option B. Access the most current version of the Aeronautical Information Manual AIM directly from the FAA's official website or an authorized publication to verify the procedure. Option C. Consult a general aviation forum or blog that discusses lost aircraft procedures. Option D. Ask the student to provide their personal copy of the AIM for reference. The correct answer is B. Access the most current version of the Aeronautical Information Manual, AIM, directly from the FAA's official website or an authorized publication to verify the procedure. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because a ground instructor must ensure that all aeronautical information provided to students is current and accurate, directly impacting flight safety. Misinterpreting or failing to access the most up-to-date Aeronautical Information Manual AIM can lead to the dissemination of outdated procedures or navigational data, potentially endangering students and the public. The instructor's responsibility extends beyond simply teaching. It involves actively maintaining their knowledge base through reliable sources. The correct approach involves consulting the official, current edition of the Aeronautical Information Manual, AIM, directly from the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA website, or through an authorized publication. This ensures that the information presented to students aligns with current regulations, procedures, and advisories. The FAA mandates that all aviation personnel adhere to the standards and guidance outlined in the AIM. Relying on the most recent version is a direct compliance with this regulatory expectation and an ethical imperative for ensuring student safety and competence. An incorrect approach involves relying on a student's personal copy of the AIM, especially if it is an older edition. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for current information and introduces a significant risk of teaching outdated or incorrect procedures. The FAA expects instructors to be the authoritative source of current information, not to delegate this responsibility or rely on potentially unverified student resources. Another incorrect approach is to assume that information from a general aviation forum or blog is a reliable substitute for the AIM. While these sources may offer helpful insights, they are not official FAA publications and may contain inaccuracies, personal opinions, or outdated information. The AIM is the definitive source for aeronautical information, and deviating from it without official updates or clarifications from the FAA is a regulatory and ethical failure. A further incorrect approach is to prioritize speed of response over accuracy by providing an answer based on memory without verifying it against the current AIM. While instructors are expected to be knowledgeable, memory can be fallible, and aviation regulations and procedures are subject to change. The professional decision-making process should always involve a commitment to accuracy, even if it requires a brief pause to consult the official source. This ensures that the instructor acts as a reliable and trustworthy educator, upholding the highest standards of aviation safety and professionalism. Question 11. The risk matrix shows a moderate probability of a student pilot experiencing an episode of dizziness or disorientation during flight training due to a reported history of migraines. As a ground instructor, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Cease flight instruction and advise the student to consult with an aviation medical examiner, AIM, to determine their medical fitness to fly. Option B. Proceed with flight instruction, as the student has a history of migraines and not a current, acute condition. Option C. Advise the student that their migraine history is minor and unlikely to affect their ability to fly safely. Option D. Contact the student's personal physician to obtain a medical opinion on their fitness to fly. The correct answer is A. Cease flight instruction and advise the student to consult with an aviation medical examiner, AIM, to determine their medical fitness to fly. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a ground instructor to balance the immediate need for flight instruction with the paramount responsibility of ensuring aviation safety. A student pilot presenting with symptoms that could indicate a disqualifying medical condition creates a complex ethical and regulatory dilemma. The instructor must not only assess the immediate risk to the student and others, but also understand the nuances of medical certification regulations without overstepping their own professional boundaries or providing medical advice. The challenge lies in making a prompt, informed decision that upholds safety standards while respecting the student's rights and the roles of aviation medical examiners. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves recognizing the potential for a disqualifying medical condition and taking appropriate action to prevent the student from flying. This aligns with the ground instructor's duty to ensure that all flight operations are conducted safely and in accordance with regulations. Specifically, the instructor must cease flight instruction and advise the student to consult with an aviation medical examiner, AIM, to determine their medical fitness to fly. This action directly addresses the potential safety hazard posed by an undisclosed or unassessed medical condition, which could impair judgment, coordination, or reaction time, thereby jeopardizing the flight. This approach prioritizes safety and adheres to the principle that only individuals medically certified are permitted to exercise the privileges of a pilot certificate. Incorrect approach is analysis. Proceeding with flight instruction despite the observed symptoms is a direct violation of safety protocols and regulatory requirements. It places the student, the instructor, and potentially the public at undue risk. This approach fails to acknowledge the instructor's responsibility to identify and mitigate safety hazards. Advising the student that the symptoms are minor and not a concern for flight privileges is also an unacceptable approach. A ground instructor is not qualified to make medical judgments or to determine what constitutes a disqualifying medical condition. This constitutes practicing medicine without a license and can lead to a pilot flying with a condition that could lead to incapacitation or an accident. Contacting the student's personal physician for a medical opinion bypasses the established regulatory framework for medical certification. The FAA, or Relevant Aviation Authority, has specific procedures and designated AMEs for assessing pilot medical fitness. Relying on a non-aviation medical professional's opinion, even if well-intentioned, does not satisfy the regulatory requirements for medical certification and may not consider the unique demands of aviation. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should follow a clear decision-making process. 1. Identify potential safety hazards. Recognize any observable signs or symptoms that could impair a pilot's ability to safely operate an aircraft. 2. Consult regulatory guidance. Be familiar with the relevant regulations concerning medical certification and disqualifying conditions. 3. Prioritize safety. If there is any doubt about a student's medical fitness, err on the side of caution and prevent them from flying. 4. Refer to appropriate authorities. Direct the individual to the designated medical professionals, e.g., AIM, for assessment and certification. 5. Maintain professional boundaries. Do not attempt to diagnose, treat, or provide medical opinions. Question 12. Research into the requirements for obtaining a Certified Flight Instructor (CFI) certificate in the United States reveals that a pilot is seeking guidance from a ground instructor. The pilot has a commercial pilot certificate and has accumulated significant flight time. The ground instructor needs to advise the pilot on the specific steps and qualifications beyond just holding a pilot certificate. What is the most accurate and regulatory compliant advice the ground instructor can provide regarding the flight instructor certification process? Option A. Inform the pilot that they must pass a specific flight instructor knowledge test and a practical test, demonstrating proficiency in instructing and a thorough understanding of aeronautical principles, in addition to meeting aeronautical experience requirements. Option B. Recommend that the pilot's existing commercial pilot certificate endorsements and flight reviews are adequate preparation for the flight instructor practical test, eliminating the need for a separate knowledge test. Option C. Suggest that the pilot can obtain a flight instructor certificate by simply completing a ground school course focused on teaching techniques, as practical flight experience is less critical for this rating. Option D. Advise the pilot that holding a commercial pilot certificate and meeting the minimum flight hour requirements is sufficient to begin training for the flight instructor knowledge and practical tests. The correct answer is D. Advise the pilot that holding a commercial pilot certificate and meeting the minimum flight hour requirements is sufficient to begin training for the flight instructor knowledge and practical tests. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a ground instructor to navigate the specific requirements for obtaining and maintaining a flight instructor certificate, which are distinct from pilot certificates. The challenge lies in accurately recalling and applying the detailed regulatory provisions governing instructor qualifications, rather than general aviation knowledge. Careful judgment is required to ensure that advice provided to aspiring instructors is compliant and effective. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the Federal Aviation Regulations, FAR, specifically Part 61, which outlines the eligibility, aeronautical knowledge, and flight proficiency requirements for flight instructor certification. This includes knowing the minimum flight time, the specific knowledge areas to be tested, and the practical test standards. Providing guidance based on these regulations ensures that the aspiring instructor is on the correct path to certification and avoids potential delays or disqualification. An incorrect approach would be to rely on outdated information or general assumptions about instructor qualifications. This could lead to advising an individual to pursue a path that does not meet current regulatory standards, such as neglecting specific endorsement requirements or misinterpreting the knowledge test prerequisites. Another incorrect approach would be to provide advice based on personal experience without verifying it against the current FARs. While experience is valuable, regulations are the definitive source for certification requirements. Failing to adhere to these specific regulatory mandates constitutes a significant professional failure, as it misleads the student and undermines the integrity of the certification process. Professionals should use a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Identifying the specific regulatory framework applicable to the situation, in this case, U.S. FAR's Part 61 for flight instructor certification. 2. Consulting the most current version of the regulations and relevant advisory circulars. 3. Applying the regulatory requirements directly to the individual's circumstances. 4. Clearly communicating these requirements to the student, emphasizing the need for adherence. If unsure, seeking clarification from official FAA sources or experienced aviation legal counsel is paramount. Question 13. To address the challenge of ensuring a student pilot fully comprehends and can execute all mandated per-flight actions for a cross-country flight, which of the following teaching approaches best exemplifies adherence to general operating rules and promotes a strong safety culture? Option A. Explain the importance of per-flight checks in general terms but skip detailed explanations of specific data sources like NOTAM, as they are considered advanced topics. Option B. Briefly outline the general categories of per-flight checks, assuming the student will research the specifics independently. Option C. Focus primarily on the flight maneuvers, mentioning that per-flight checks are a routine administrative task that can be learned on the job. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive review of all required per-flight actions, detailing the purpose and regulatory basis for checking weather, NOTAM, fuel calculations, and weight and balance, and then quiz the student on their understanding of each component's impact on flight safety. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive review of all required per-flight actions, detailing the purpose and regulatory basis for checking weather, NOTAM, fuel calculations, and weight and balance, and then quiz the student on their understanding of each component's impact on flight safety. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent responsibility of a ground instructor to impart accurate and safe operating procedures to student pilots. The instructor must not only understand the regulations, but also be able to apply them in a way that fosters a strong safety culture. The core of the challenge lies in correctly interpreting and applying the general operating rules, specifically per-flight action, in a practical teaching context. The correct approach involves a thorough and systematic review of all required per-flight actions as mandated by the regulations. This includes checking weather reports, NOTAM, fuel requirements, and aircraft weight and balance, and then ensuring the student understands the significance of each element for safe flight. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the regulatory framework, emphasizing a proactive and comprehensive safety mindset. Specifically, regulations such as 14 CFR 91.103 per-flight action mandate that pilots in command shall, before beginning a flight, familiarize themselves with all available information concerning that flight. A ground instructor's duty is to ensure students are thoroughly trained on these requirements, leaving no room for assumptions or omissions. An incorrect approach would be to only briefly mention per-flight checks without detailing their importance or the specific information to be gathered. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement of familiarization and can lead to a student pilot developing a superficial understanding of safety procedures, potentially overlooking critical factors that could compromise flight safety. Another incorrect approach is to assume the student has prior knowledge and skip a detailed explanation, which is a dereliction of the instructor's duty to teach and verify understanding. This bypasses the essential educational component of ground instruction and can result in significant knowledge gaps. Finally, focusing solely on the mechanical aspects of per-flight without discussing the decision-making process and risk assessment involved would be an incomplete approach, as it neglects the cognitive elements crucial for safe aviation. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a commitment to thoroughness, clarity, and the principle of see and avoid applied to knowledge. Instructors must anticipate potential student misunderstandings and proactively address them. They should adopt a teaching methodology that prioritizes understanding over rote memorization, ensuring students can articulate the why behind each regulation and procedure. Question 14. Analysis of a student pilot's request to begin training in a high-performance and complex aircraft, citing their enthusiasm and previous experience in a standard trainer aircraft, requires the ground instructor to perform a risk assessment. Which approach best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional safety standards for this situation? Option A. Endorse the student for training in the high-performance and complex aircraft immediately, given their expressed eagerness and prior flight experience. Option B. Proceed with training in the high-performance and complex aircraft, assuming the student will learn the necessary systems and procedures as they go. Option C. Rely on the student's self-assessment of their readiness and comfort level with the new aircraft type to determine if they are prepared for training. Option D. Conduct a thorough review of the student's aeronautical knowledge and demonstrated piloting skills, verifying their understanding of aerodynamics, systems, and emergency procedures relevant to high-performance and complex aircraft before providing an endorsement. The correct answer is A. Endorse the student for training in the high-performance and complex aircraft immediately, given their expressed eagerness and prior flight experience. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the ground instructor to accurately assess a student's readiness for high-performance and complex aircraft training, balancing the student's enthusiasm with the critical need for safety and regulatory compliance. Misjudging a student's capabilities can lead to unsafe training practices, potential accidents, and a failure to meet regulatory standards for pilot certification. Careful judgment is required to ensure the student possesses the necessary foundational knowledge and psychomotor skills before progressing to more demanding aircraft. The correct approach involves a thorough risk assessment that prioritizes the student's demonstrated proficiency and understanding of foundational principles before introducing high-performance and complex aircraft. This aligns with the regulatory framework's emphasis on ensuring pilots are adequately trained and competent. Specifically, regulations require that a student demonstrate a certain level of aeronautical knowledge and skill before being endorsed for training in aircraft with characteristics such as retractable landing gear, controllable pitch propellers, or higher horsepower engines. This approach ensures that the student can safely manage the increased workload and unique handling qualities associated with these aircraft, thereby mitigating risks. An incorrect approach that involves immediately endorsing the student based solely on their expressed eagerness and prior experience in simpler aircraft fails to acknowledge the significant differences in aircraft systems and performance. It overlooks the regulatory requirement for specific endorsements and training in complex and high-performance aircraft, potentially leading to a student being unprepared for the demands of these aircraft. Another incorrect approach, which is to proceed with training without verifying the student's understanding of the specific systems and aerodynamics of the high-performance or complex aircraft, directly contravenes the principle of progressive training and risk management. This could result in the student developing unsafe habits or being unable to safely operate the aircraft in various conditions. Finally, an approach that relies on the student's self-assessment of readiness without objective evaluation by the instructor neglects the instructor's professional responsibility and the regulatory oversight required for pilot training. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the regulatory requirements for endorsements and training in high-performance and complex aircraft. This involves evaluating the student's current knowledge and skill level against these specific requirements. A systematic assessment of the student's ability to manage increased workload, understand advanced systems, and execute precise control inputs is crucial. If any doubt exists regarding the student's preparedness, further foundational training or review should be mandated before progressing. This ensures that training is conducted safely, effectively, and in full compliance with aviation regulations. Question 15. The investigation demonstrates that a ground instructor preparing student pilots for a cross-country flight reviewed a general weather app on their phone and provided a summary of expected conditions, including a general temperature and chance of precipitation, without consulting official aviation weather products. Which of the following actions best reflects the regulatory requirements for a ground instructor in this scenario? Option A. Briefly mentioning that the weather app shows a chance of rain and advising students to be cautious if they encounter precipitation. Option B. Relying on the general weather app as it provides a quick overview and is sufficient for general aviation training. Option C. Focusing on the aircraft's performance capabilities and assuming students will independently check detailed weather information before departure. Option D. Accessing and interpreting the latest METR and TAF for the departure and destination airports, and discussing any relevant AirMet or SIGMET with the students, explaining their impact on the planned flight. The correct answer is D. Accessing and interpreting the latest METR and TAF for the departure and destination airports, and discussing any relevant AirMet or SIGMET with the students, explaining their impact on the planned flight. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a scenario where a ground instructor must interpret and communicate meteorological information to student pilots. This is professionally challenging because the instructor bears the responsibility for ensuring students understand critical weather phenomena that directly impact flight safety. Misinterpretation or incomplete communication can lead to dangerous decision-making by pilots. Careful judgment is required to select the most accurate and relevant meteorological information for the specific context of flight training. The correct approach involves prioritizing official aviation weather reports and forecasts that are directly applicable to the planned flight, such as METR, TAF, and AirMet/SIGMET, and explaining their implications in a clear, concise manner that emphasizes safety. This aligns with regulatory requirements for aviation training, which mandate the dissemination of accurate and current weather information to foster safe piloting practices. The instructor's duty is to translate complex meteorological data into actionable knowledge for students, ensuring they can make informed decisions regarding flight operations. An incorrect approach that relies solely on general weather apps or personal observations fails to meet regulatory standards for aviation weather dissemination. These sources may lack the precision, timeliness, or specific aviation-relevant details required by regulations. Furthermore, presenting weather information without explaining its direct impact on flight operations, such as visibility, turbulence, or icing conditions, constitutes a failure to adequately prepare students for the hazards they might encounter. Relying on outdated or unverified weather data is also a significant regulatory and ethical failure, as it directly compromises the safety of flight training. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the specific regulatory requirements for weather briefing and training. This involves understanding the types of weather information mandated for pilot training and the sources from which this information must be obtained. The next step is to assess the current and forecast weather conditions relevant to the training area and planned flight. Finally, the instructor must translate this official information into clear, understandable terms for the student, emphasizing the safety implications and potential hazards. Question 16. During the evaluation of a student pilot's concerns about their ability to obtain a medical certificate due to a pre-existing medical condition, which of the following actions by a ground instructor best adheres to regulatory requirements and professional ethics? Option A. Tell the student not to worry about the medical certificate at this stage and to focus solely on their flight training, as most issues can be resolved later. Option B. Advise the student to consult the FAA's Guide for Aviation Medical Examiners and the relevant sections of the Federal Aviation Regulations, FAR, concerning medical certification, and strongly recommend they schedule an appointment with an aviation medical examiner, AIM, to discuss their specific situation. Option C. Suggest specific dietary changes and exercise routines that might improve the student's health and potentially aid in their medical certification process. Option D. Offer an opinion on whether the student's condition is likely to prevent them from obtaining a medical certificate, based on general knowledge of common disqualifying conditions. The correct answer is B. Advise the student to consult the FAA's Guide for Aviation Medical Examiners and the relevant sections of the Federal Aviation Regulations, FAR, concerning medical certification, and strongly recommend they schedule an appointment with an aviation medical examiner, AIM, to discuss their specific situation. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because a ground instructor must accurately interpret and apply complex medical certification standards to advise students. Misinterpreting these requirements can lead to significant delays, financial burdens, and discouragement for aspiring pilots, potentially impacting their career aspirations. The instructor must balance providing helpful guidance with the strict limitations of their role, avoiding the unauthorized practice of medicine or legal advice. The correct approach involves guiding the student to the official FAA resources and emphasizing that the instructor's role is informational, not diagnostic or prescriptive. This aligns with regulatory requirements that ground instructors provide instruction on aeronautical knowledge and skills, not medical advice. The FAA's Aeronautical Information Manual, AIM, and the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, are the definitive sources for medical certification standards. By directing the student to these official documents and advising them to consult an aviation medical examiner, AIM, the instructor acts within their scope of practice and ensures the student receives accurate, authoritative information. An incorrect approach that involves the instructor attempting to interpret the student's specific medical condition and predict the outcome of their medical certificate application is professionally unacceptable. This constitutes practicing medicine without a license and overstepping the instructor's defined role. It can lead to the student making decisions based on potentially flawed advice, resulting in wasted time and resources. Another incorrect approach, which is to dismiss the student's concerns and suggest they will probably be fine, is also professionally and ethically flawed. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to recognize the critical importance of medical certification. It can lead to the student proceeding without understanding the potential hurdles, only to face disqualification later. Finally, an incorrect approach that involves the instructor suggesting specific treatments or lifestyle changes to fix the medical condition is a direct violation of professional boundaries and regulatory guidelines. This is the unauthorized practice of medicine and can have serious health consequences for the student, in addition to jeopardizing their aviation career. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to regulatory scope, accurate information dissemination, and student well-being. This involves 1. Identifying the core issue medical certification requirements. 2. Consulting authoritative regulatory sources, FAA regulations, AIM. 3. Clearly defining the instructor's role and limitations. 4. Directing the student to the appropriate authorities, AIM. 5. Providing information, not advice or diagnosis. Question 17. Governance review demonstrates that during a simulated multi-engine aircraft emergency involving a complete failure of one engine shortly after takeoff, a pilot's immediate actions were to contact air traffic control to declare an emergency and request vectors to the nearest suitable airport, before attempting to establish a stable flight path and assess the aircraft's performance. Which of the following represents the most appropriate and regulatory compliant immediate course of action for the pilot in this scenario? Option A. Begin troubleshooting the failed engine to identify the cause and potential remedies while maintaining a general heading. Option B. Immediately contact air traffic control to declare an emergency and request vectors to the nearest suitable airport, while simultaneously attempting to stabilize the aircraft. Option C. Prioritize passenger announcements regarding the emergency situation before taking any control actions or contacting air traffic control. Option D. Immediately establish a stable flight path and assess aircraft performance, then execute the engine failure emergency checklist and subsequently communicate with air traffic control. The correct answer is D. Immediately establish a stable flight path and assess aircraft performance, then execute the engine failure emergency checklist and subsequently communicate with air traffic control. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a critical in-flight emergency requiring immediate and decisive action. The challenge lies in the pilot's need to accurately assess the situation, recall and apply appropriate emergency procedures under extreme stress, and communicate effectively with air traffic control and passengers, all while maintaining aircraft control. The pilot's judgment is paramount, as a misstep could have severe consequences. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves prioritizing immediate aircraft control, then assessing the nature of the engine failure, and finally executing the established emergency procedures for engine failure in flight. This aligns with fundamental aviation safety principles and regulatory requirements. Specifically, the pilot must first maintain airspeed and altitude to prevent a stall or uncontrolled descent, then diagnose the problem, e.g., identify the failed engine, and subsequently follow the checklist for engine failure, which includes actions like securing the engine, declaring an emergency, and initiating a forced landing or diversion. This systematic approach ensures that the most critical tasks are addressed first, maximizing the chances of a safe outcome. Regulatory frameworks, such as those outlined by the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, for pilot training and certification, mandate proficiency in handling such emergencies, emphasizing the importance of following established procedures. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that prioritizes immediate communication with ATC without first stabilizing the aircraft is incorrect. While communication is vital, attempting to relay information while struggling to maintain control of the aircraft diverts critical attention and cognitive resources away from the primary task of flying. This could lead to a loss of control or a failure to execute essential immediate actions, violating the principle of aviate, navigate, communicate. An approach that involves attempting complex troubleshooting of the engine failure while airborne, without first following the established emergency checklist, is also incorrect. While understanding the cause of the failure might be desirable, the immediate priority is to manage the emergency. The checklist is designed to address the most critical actions in a logical sequence to ensure safety, and deviating from it without a clear and compelling reason, e.g., a known, simple fix that doesn't compromise safety, is a significant procedural and safety failure. An approach that focuses solely on passenger comfort or reassurance before taking control actions is incorrect. While passenger well-being is a consideration, the pilot's primary responsibility is the safe operation of the aircraft. Addressing the immediate flight control and emergency procedures takes precedence over passenger management in the initial critical moments of an engine failure. Passenger announcements should be made once the immediate flight safety is assured. Professional reasoning. In any in-flight emergency, pilots should employ the aviate, navigate, communicate mantra. First, fly the aircraft. Second, determine the aircraft's position and intended course. Third, inform relevant parties. For engine failures, this translates to maintaining aircraft control, assessing the situation, executing the appropriate emergency checklist, and then communicating with ATC and passengers. This structured decision-making process, reinforced by regulatory training and recurrent checks, ensures that critical actions are taken in the correct order, minimizing risk and maximizing the probability of a safe resolution. Question 18. Compliance review shows that a ground instructor is developing a training program for pilots seeking to operate under FAR Part 119. Which approach best ensures the training program meets the regulatory intent and operational realities of FAR Part 119? Option A. Focus on providing a broad overview of aviation principles, ensuring pilots understand fundamental aerodynamics and meteorology. Option B. Develop a curriculum that directly addresses the operational requirements, pilot training program standards, and management responsibilities outlined in FAR Part 119, linking theoretical knowledge to practical application within a commercial operating environment. Option C. Emphasize the use of advanced simulation technology to provide pilots with hands-on experience, assuming regulatory compliance will be implicitly covered. Option D. Prioritize covering as many aircraft systems as possible within the allotted training time, without specific reference to their operational implications under Part 119. The correct answer is A. Focus on providing a broad overview of aviation principles, ensuring pilots understand fundamental aerodynamics and meteorology. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an instructor to interpret and apply complex regulatory requirements, FAR Part 119, to a practical training situation, ensuring that the training provided aligns with the operational standards expected of commercial operators. The challenge lies in bridging the gap between theoretical knowledge of regulations and the practical implications for pilot training, particularly concerning the specific operational limitations and requirements that an air carrier must adhere to. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the training is not only comprehensive, but also legally compliant and prepares pilots for the realities of commercial operations. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of FAR Part 119, specifically focusing on how it dictates the operational standards and training requirements for air carriers. This approach prioritizes the accurate identification and explanation of how Part 119 provisions, such as those related to pilot training programs, operational specifications, and management responsibilities, directly impact the curriculum and delivery of ground instruction. By linking the regulatory framework to the practical training needs of pilots operating under Part 119, the instructor ensures that the training is relevant, compliant, and effectively prepares pilots for their roles. This aligns with the ethical responsibility of an instructor to provide accurate and legally sound education. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on general aviation principles, without referencing the specific operational context of FAR Part 119, fails to meet the regulatory requirements for training commercial operators. This approach is professionally unacceptable because it neglects the unique and often more stringent standards imposed by Part 119, potentially leaving pilots ill-prepared for the operational environment they will encounter. Another incorrect approach that emphasizes only the theoretical aspects of flight, without connecting them to the practical application within a Part 119 operation, is also professionally flawed. This approach misses the crucial link between foundational knowledge and the operational realities of commercial aviation, such as specific aircraft systems, emergency procedures, and crew resource management, as mandated by Part 119. A further incorrect approach that prioritizes speed of instruction over regulatory accuracy and completeness is ethically and professionally unsound. This approach risks providing incomplete or misleading information, which can have serious safety and compliance consequences for both the pilot and the operator. The professional decision-making process for similar situations involves a systematic review of the relevant regulatory framework. In this case, FAR Part 119, identifying the specific requirements that pertain to the training being delivered. This is followed by an assessment of how these requirements translate into practical training content and methodologies. Instructors must then ensure that their instruction directly addresses these requirements, providing clear explanations and practical examples. Continuous professional development and staying abreast of regulatory updates are also crucial to maintaining compliance and providing high-quality instruction. Question 19. Comparative studies suggest that while GPS has revolutionized aviation navigation, its effective use hinges on a pilot's comprehensive understanding of its operational characteristics and limitations. As a ground instructor, how should you best address a student's question about relying solely on GPS for navigation during a cross-country flight, considering the regulatory emphasis on pilot responsibility and situational awareness? Option A. Explain that GPS is highly reliable and can be used as the sole navigation source, provided the unit is certified and updated. Option B. Suggest that the pilot should primarily focus on understanding the GPS unit's features and functions, as the technology itself mitigates most navigational risks. Option C. Advise the student that modern GPS units are so advanced that traditional navigation methods are largely obsolete for cross-country flights. Option D. Emphasize that while GPS is a primary tool, pilots must always maintain situational awareness of their position by cross-referencing GPS data with other navigation aids, charts, and visual observation, and understand potential GPS limitations. The correct answer is A. Explain that GPS is highly reliable and can be used as the sole navigation source, provided the unit is certified and updated. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a ground instructor because it requires them to evaluate the practical application of GPS technology in aviation, specifically concerning its limitations and the pilot's responsibility for understanding these. The instructor must guide the student towards a comprehensive understanding that goes beyond simply knowing GPS exists, emphasizing the critical need for awareness of its operational constraints and the pilot's ultimate accountability for safe navigation. Careful judgment is required to ensure the student grasps the nuances of GPS reliability and the importance of cross-referencing information. The correct approach involves emphasizing that while GPS is a powerful tool, it is not infallible, and pilots must maintain situational awareness of its limitations, including potential signal degradation, interference, and the need for cross-checking with other navigation sources. This aligns with the regulatory framework that places the ultimate responsibility for safe flight and navigation on the pilot in command. The instructor's role is to foster this understanding by highlighting the importance of understanding the system's limitations and the necessity of cross-referencing GPS data with other available navigation aids and visual cues. This promotes a culture of safety and adherence to regulatory expectations for pilot proficiency and judgment. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the technological capabilities of GPS, implying it is a foolproof navigation system. This fails to address the regulatory requirement for pilots to be proficient in the use of all available navigation aids and to understand their limitations. Another incorrect approach would be to suggest that the pilot can solely rely on GPS without any cross-checking, which directly contradicts the principle of maintaining situational awareness and the pilot's responsibility for verifying navigation accuracy. Furthermore, an approach that dismisses the importance of understanding GPS failure modes or potential inaccuracies would be professionally negligent, as it fails to prepare the student for real-world operational challenges and potential emergencies. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the core regulatory and safety principles at play. In this case, it's pilot responsibility, situational awareness, and understanding navigation system limitations. They should then evaluate each potential teaching approach against these principles, considering how effectively it promotes safe and compliant aviation practices. The decision-making process should prioritize fostering critical thinking and a deep understanding of operational realities over superficial knowledge of technology. Question 20. Operational review demonstrates that during a simulated engine failure scenario, a ground instructor must guide students through the critical initial actions, which approach best aligns with regulatory requirements for emergency procedures and instructor responsibilities. Option A. Attempt to troubleshoot and restart the engine immediately, assuming that a successful restart will resolve the emergency without further action. Option B. Immediately initiate the aircraft's emergency checklist for engine failure, focusing on maintaining aircraft control, identifying a suitable landing area, and communicating the situation to air traffic control. Option C. Focus primarily on reassuring the students and explaining the potential consequences of an engine failure, delaying active emergency procedures until the situation is fully assessed. Option D. Improvise a landing procedure based on the instructor's best judgment, deviating from standard checklists if it seems more efficient in the moment. The correct answer is B. Immediately initiate the aircraft's emergency checklist for engine failure, focusing on maintaining aircraft control, identifying a suitable landing area, and communicating the situation to air traffic control. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an instructor to balance immediate safety concerns with the need to maintain composure and provide clear, actionable guidance during a high-stress event. The instructor's primary responsibility is the safety of their students, which necessitates a swift and accurate response. However, the effectiveness of that response is directly tied to the instructor's ability to remain calm and follow established emergency procedures, rather than reacting impulsively or relying on incomplete information. The correct approach involves prioritizing immediate safety by initiating the established emergency checklist for engine failure, which includes actions like maintaining aircraft control, selecting a suitable landing area, and communicating the situation. This is justified by regulatory frameworks that mandate specific procedures for in-flight emergencies to maximize the chances of a safe outcome. Adherence to these checklists ensures that critical steps are not overlooked and that the response is systematic and effective, aligning with the principle of ensuring the safety of all persons on board. An incorrect approach that involves immediately attempting to restart the engine without first ensuring aircraft control and identifying a landing site is professionally unacceptable. This bypasses critical safety steps and could lead to a loss of control or a forced landing in an unsuitable area, directly violating the instructor's duty of care and regulatory requirements for emergency management. Another incorrect approach, such as focusing solely on student comfort and reassurance without taking decisive action to address the engine failure, fails to meet the instructor's primary safety obligations. While student well-being is important, it cannot supersede the immediate need to manage the emergency and secure the aircraft. This approach neglects the core responsibilities outlined in aviation regulations for emergency response. Finally, an incorrect approach that involves improvising a procedure based on incomplete knowledge or memory, rather than strictly following the established emergency checklist, is also professionally unacceptable. Aviation safety relies on standardized, tested procedures. Deviating from these without a clear, overriding justification based on the specific circumstances and regulatory guidance introduces unacceptable risk and undermines the integrity of the safety system. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that emphasizes immediate threat assessment, adherence to established emergency procedures, clear communication, and continuous evaluation of the situation. This framework prioritizes safety, leverages training and regulatory guidance, and promotes a systematic, rather than reactive, response to emergencies.